Samuel Ely Johnson Jr. was born on October 11th, 1877, to Samuel Sr. and Eliza. Rebecca Baines was born on June 26, 1881, to Joseph Wilson and Ruth Baines. Samuel Sr. was so relieved to have a son that he named the child after himself, dressed him similarly to himself, and took the boy with him wherever he could. Dalek describes Samuel Jr. as gregarious, friendly, outgoing, and fiercely competitive with an urge to dominate people. Samuel Jr. was called Little Sam to distinguish him from his father, and despite the inability of his parents to afford sending him to the one-room schoolhouse in Johnson City, he was determined to gain an education. Joseph taught Rebecca how to read, that a lie is an abomination to the Lord, and the values of obedience, self-control, and self-confidence. The girl was less devoted to her mother, but idealized her as well, even remarking later that she was the fortunate offspring of a happy, well-adjusted, and devoted couple. When Rebecca was 6, she came to Blanco. In subsequent years, she was forced to take a job at a Baylor College bookstore to pay the costs of her final year in school, and adjusted to the death of her father, the dominant force in her life, with all of her determination and strength of will. Samuel Jr. and Rebecca would ultimately meet in Austin in 1906 and married the following year, on August 20th, 1907. Samuel and Rebecca would have their first child, a boy, on August 27th, 1908, in a small farmhouse. Reflecting on his birth, Lyndon would later say of his mother, "The first year of her marriage was the worst year of her life. Then I came along and suddenly everything was all right again. I could do all the things she never did." The new parents could not decide on a name for their firstborn, with Samuel viewing the names his wife suggested as too feminine. In November, the couple would finally agree to name him after Samuel's lawyer friend W.C. Lyndon, albeit with Rebecca only agreeing after changing the spelling of the name from Linden to Lynndon. The boy's middle name, Baines, would be derived from his mother's maiden name. Lyndon enjoyed good relationships with both of his parents. By the time Lyndon was 3, he was following his dad everywhere, and he grew even closer to him when the family moved to Johnson City in 1913, and he saw less of his grandfather. Johnson would later say that he wanted to copy his father, emulate him, and do the things he did, noting that his father loved political life and public service, and that he had followed him as a child and participated in it. Historian Doris Kearns remembers that when she spoke to Johnson of his early years, he spoke almost entirely of his mother and only spoke of his father to enumerate his liabilities as a husband and to explain what he did to Rebecca. Dalek speculates that Johnson may have already favored his mother by the time he was 6 years old, as he had selected the poem titled "I'd Rather Be Mama's Boy" when asked to read a poem for classmates and their parents. When Lyndon was 8, he quit violin and stopped taking dancing lessons, prompting his disappointed mother to pretend he was dead. Several people who observed their relationship spoke of Rebecca having a certain hold on Lyndon, and according to Dalek, she endowed him with the belief that he could do anything, that nothing was too hard for him, and Lyndon reciprocated the feeling. Johnson would later tell an interviewer that were it not for her, he might not have made it through either high school or college, and called her a constant, dog-determined influence on my life. From the start, there would be foreshadowing of Lyndon's destiny. In spring 1909, the Johnsons attended a picnic where Lyndon greeted each neighbor with smiles, causing one neighbor to remark, "Sam, you've got a politician there. I've never before seen such a friendly baby. He's a chip off the old block. I can just see him running for office 20 years from now." When Lyndon graduated high school, his classmates would consider the possibility that he could become governor of Texas. In 1918, Sam Johnson began taking his oldest child with him to the state legislature. He would either sit or stand by his father, wander around to see what was going on, and run errands for his father despite not being an official page. Sam Johnson won re-election in November 1918 and took Lyndon with him to a celebration in San Antonio. Lyndon's closest childhood friend, Ben Kreider, remembered Lyndon being very proud of his father's record as a member of the Texas House. Lyndon by age 12 had become an extension of his parents. Although disappointing them by not being the top student in his class, he was similar to both in taking a back seat to no one and being a distinct member of the community. In 1921, the 13-year-old Lyndon won first place in a meet in Fredericksburg for a speech that pleaded against splitting Texas into multiple states. Dalek writes that Lyndon's characteristics were the product of both his parents and the environment for which he grew up in, noting that Johnson City and the hill country played a significant part in shaping him. At the time Lyndon began attending Johnson City High School, the school was unaccredited, and its graduates tended to take additional work before they could become regularly enrolled college students. Scott Cleet, the superintendent of Johnson City High School, taught a civics course that greatly interested Lyndon in how government worked. Johnson City, as the county seat, held a courthouse that attracted much attention, with president of the American Political Science Association, Emmett Redford, later remarking that he and Lyndon were more interested in what happened at the courthouse than the three churches in the town. Lyndon established a reputation as a student who was both indifferent and treated all things as jokes, scoring B's mainly from being quicker than his schoolmates and fooling teachers. In May 1924, Johnson completed his final grade at the Johnson City High School, and at 15 was the youngest member of his class and believed to be the youngest graduate in the school's history. After his graduation, he ran away to California, defying his parents' wishes and joining a group of 4 friends from Johnson City who were all heading in search of better things. The 5 took the 10-day trip in a 1918 Model T Ford and mainly traveled during the night to keep the car from overheating in the desert sun, entering California with only $8 between them. The group went to San Bernardino, and Lyndon started staying with Tom Martin, who agreed to have Lyndon work as a clerk for the former's law office. The Johnsons consented to Martin's mentorship, and although Lyndon was enthusiastic, even getting Martin to let his friend, John Coninger, share a room with him, the agreement fell through due to Martin's unreliability. By summer 1925, Lyndon, John, and the secretary were running Martin's office after the latter went on a drinking spree, moved his mistress into the home while his wife and child were away, and ran what Dalek calls an almost continuous party. That fall, Martin's wife returned to Texas, and Lyndon drove back to Texas, later calling his stay in California a vagabond life. Lyndon returned to living with his parents and got a construction job with help from his father, only earning $2 to $3 a day from the exhausting job. The frustrated Lyndon vent his anger by joining a group called the Wild Bunch, who drank, got into fights, held drag races in cars they drove without permission, and stole dynamite from the state highway department to set off in the middle of night. Lyndon remained on the job until January 1927, at which point Dan Moody replaced Ferguson as governor and notified each appointee in the highway department that they would be replaced too. The following month, Lyndon attended a dance in Fredericksburg where he got into a fight with a German farm boy who beat him unmercifully until he was bleeding from his nose and mouth. The incident drove Rebecca to tears and is credited by Lyndon's cousin Ava as getting him to realize he wasn't the cock of the walk. Lyndon then agreed to go to college. Though he wanted to attend the cheap Southwest Texas State Teachers College, Lyndon initially did not have the money. His in-debt father could not help him, and the younger Johnson was denied a loan from the Johnson City Bank, though he was able to scrape enough money together to attend. Dalek writes that Johnson also needed to satisfy the school's admission standards and then discipline himself to do college-level work, and that Lyndon's ambition to earn a college degree and make something special of his life outweighed his fears. Johnson met with Professor David Fota, who remembered Lyndon wanting to get an education to both develop an understanding of government and aid in improving the world. Fota assigned Johnson to San Marcos to prove the latter's competency in both English and math. Johnson received a D in debate or argumentation and did poorly in grammar, while the rest of his work was satisfactory, with 2 C's and a B. Johnson did not have enough money to get to the conclusion of the term after spending part of his 100. The editor of the College Star was one of the highest paying jobs on campus for students, with $50 a month as the salary, but Johnson's inexperience as a journalist and lack of notability among his peers made him unlikely to take the job. He sought to overcome this obstacle by writing editorials. Dalek describes Johnson as an exceptionally warm person who made friends easily and took a genuine interest in them. Classmate and lifelong associate Willard Deason remembered getting into a dispute with LBJ after the pair were trying to outdo each other in a math class. After Deason stomped out into the hall, expecting to fight Lyndon, the latter wrapped his arm around Deason before making amends in what would be the start of their friendship. Johnson had a B average and made conscious efforts to please his teachers. By the beginning of 1928, Johnson had gained favor with the faculty and administration, in addition to becoming a successful debater and being elected the editor of the College Star for the summer quarter. Looming over these accomplishments was his unsuccessful attempt to become a Black Star. The most influential student group on campus made up almost entirely of athletes. Head of the Black Stars, Boobie Johnson, Lyndon's closest college friend, made several attempts to get him membership. The duo would later claim that the boy Lyndon had crossed single-handedly preventing him from joining the group. Johnson's exclusion from the Black Stars hurt him and stirred his competitive urges. His continued financial issues forced him to leave college in fall 1928. During the 6 terms he attended San Marcos, Lyndon indulged in luxuries he could not afford, such as buying clothes, expensive dates, trips out of the city, frequent barber visits, and a used car. Johnson took 5 education courses in the 1927 to 1928 school year to gain an elementary school teaching certificate. He then began teaching at a Mexican-American grade school in Cotella, earning $125 a month. At the time of Lyndon's employment, 3/4 of Cotella's inhabitants were living in hovels and dilapidated shanties that lacked either indoor plumbing or electricity. The determined LBJ sought to make a favorable impression that would see him recommended to other school boards for his quality as a teacher. The 28 boys and girls in Lyndon's combined class would often arrive at school without any breakfast, and what Lyndon called a quizzical expression on their faces that asked, "Why don't people like me? Why do they hate me because I am brown?" Dalek describes the wretched conditions of the children as striking a chord with Lyndon, who differed from the other teachers by throwing himself into the school with unbounded energy. Lyndon was asked by the school superintendent to be both the principal and a teacher, and he agreed. Lyndon even wrote a song that he expected students to be ready to greet him with when he arrived in the morning. "How do you do, Mr. Johnson? How do you do? How do you do, Mr. Johnson? How are you? We'll do it if we can. We'll stand by you to a man. How do you do, Mr. Johnson? How are you?" He required his students to speak English, complete daily homework assignments, and mind the teacher, with failure to comply resulting in prescribed punishments. LBJ gave packages of toothpaste to his students and gave them extracurricular activities such as debate, declamation, spelling bees, band, baseball, track, and a parent-teachers association to assist with after-school functions, encouraging all of his students to believe they could do something better with their lives. For as much energy as he put in his job, Lyndon felt alone in Cotella and longed to be with his family in Johnson City. He kept himself busy as the baseball and debate coach, tutoring the school's janitor to learn English, and taking courses in the San Marcos Extension program. Some of his moodiness also came from the disillusion of his relationship with Carol Davis. Although Lyndon described himself as in love with her from the moment they met, Carol's father objected to her dating a man from an impoverished family. Carol also was bored by politics, and she eventually rejected Lyndon's advances to pursue another suitor. Lyndon returned to San Marcos in May, where he reestablished contact with friends and rented a home with Booby Johnson on North Comanche. Johnson earned a B.S. degree in education and history after taking courses between September 1929 and August 1930, a period that saw him squeeze 23 courses into 4 terms, with LBJ himself saying, "I never worked so hard in all my life." Johnson joined 7 other students in forming a secret society to challenge exalted students such as the Black Stars and athletes. The group would later be known as the White Stars and expanded to at least 13 members as the school year progressed. They rallied behind Willard Deason to replace Dick Spinn as senior class president and used a combination of surprise, Lyndon's determination, and resentment among the students towards the privileged athletes to win. Deason remembered that as the election neared, the White Stars were ready to throw in the towel, but that Lyndon mounted a last-minute bid to appeal to the YMCA students, recalling LBJ's uncanny instinct to look a man in the eye and sell him his viewpoint. In the end, Deason narrowly won, only furthering the confidence of the White Stars. In one incident, Lyndon was able to get popular campaign activist Ruth Lewis out of a race by threatening to reveal that she lied about going to University of Texas rather than San Marcos, and would write an editorial on her being ashamed to be identified with the latter school, essentially blackmailing her. The White Stars held a majority of the student council seats after the spring elections. H.M. Green advised the White Stars on what to do and not to do, and kept the group from going too far. During the summer of 1930, Lyndon gave a speech in defense of Pat Neff amid the latter's bid for the State Railroad Commission. The speech was very well received and caught the attention of Welly Hopkins, a member of the Texas lower house running for state senate, who asked Lyndon to become his campaign manager. In November 1931, Lyndon accepted a position as secretary for incoming Congressman Richard Clayburgh, who had succeeded to the position following the death of incumbent Harry M. Wurzbach. After Kleberg won the election, Welly Hopkins wrote the congressman-elect suggesting Lyndon for the secretary post, calling the latter a decided asset for his connections to 14th District counties and high-level campaigning. In his first days in Washington, Johnson met Congressman John Nance Gardner and Senator Morris Shepherd. Johnson's starting salary was $3,900 a year, which Dalek notes was double what he had been paid in Houston and a substantial income for a single man in the Depression. Despite this, Johnson found his funds limited due to sending most of his money back to his struggling parents and took most of his meals in cheap eateries. Kleberg's victory had helped give the Democrats a slim majority in the House, but the congressman was mostly absentee and left the management of his office to Lyndon. The 23-year-old initially relied on an experienced stenographer who had worked for several congressmen, but found her mechanical approach to the mail disheartening. Johnson established a different approach, meeting 5 young men who he put in the service of his own education, and courting congressmen and other staff members who could give him a short course on how better to do his job. As mail arrived 3 times a day, Lyndon felt buried, but he refused to quit. Tom Connolly's secretary, Arthur Perry, took LBJ under his wing and noticed how quickly he would learn things, remarking, "You never had to tell him anything a second time." Perry also called Johnson the greatest argufier any of us had ever seen, and said he later realized this was a strategy Johnson employed to bring out every possible answer to his arguments. Johnson knew that the 500,000 constituents represented by Kleberg were the key to his success as a congressman. Johnson differed from other congressmen and aides in that he made special attempts to get the requests of constituents accommodated. In his first 6 months in Washington, Johnson handled 300 appeals from veterans for help, with 150 cases being decided during this time, and over 60% of them being favorable to the veterans. During this time, the Kleberg office, under LBJ's leadership, had also been successful in filling most of the thousands of individual requests made to the congressman's desk. The reputation of the office evolved into a corner for effective advocacy and keen interest in every constituent. Each letter sent to the office had to be answered in as personal and prompt a way as possible, with one of LBJ's assistants recalling, "It was worse than adultery to leave a letter overnight unanswered." Johnson insisted on keeping as much personal information on file for each correspondent, such as the man's wife's name or the names and ages of his children. The office functioned as well as it did due to Lyndon's unstinting effort. He would arrive 2 hours before most of the rest of the staff at 7 a.m., spend an hour writing replies, skip a lunch break, and continue to work with Estelle Harbin even when having their lunch break. After Harbin left her job, Lyndon hired Houston debaters Gene Latimer and Luther E. Jones, moving the pair into his basement room to help them make ends meet. Latimer and Jones found working for Lyndon to at times be nearly impossible, as according to Dalek, he was so commanding and occasionally so overbearing and abusive that they periodically wanted to quit. Johnson was especially abusive to the better educated Jones, who he would publicly ridicule the errors of. The ultimate humiliation of Jones came from when Johnson would insist that he follow him into the bathroom and take dictation while Johnson was on the toilet defecating. At the same time, as Jones and Latimer recognized, Lyndon was fiercely loyal to his employees. After Latimer got married, LBJ arranged for a gift for the couple from Kleberg, let them use a car for the honeymoon, and got him a job at the Federal Housing Authority. Kleberg relied on Lyndon heavily, allowing him to run his office and manage many of his business and personal affairs. Kleberg arranged for Lyndon to write letters to his mother and son, pay his bills, and parcel out Kleberg's income to keep everyone satisfied with a part payment after the free spender purchased almost everything on credit. Lyndon also became a confidant to Kleberg's wife, who the staff called Miss Mamie. Dalek describes her as a charming, handsome-looking woman who was somewhat neurotic and who possessed fears and insecurities that LBJ was tasked with calming. She once wrote to Johnson to confide that she almost broke down after discovering her husband's affair, and that she was so thankful that Johnson was with him. In another letter to LBJ, in which she signed, "Your Other Mother," she wrote that her husband could not love you more if you were his own son, and I feel just like he does. Within 6 months of becoming Kleberg's secretary, his family had become dependent on the 23-year-old. Around this time, Lyndon decided there should be a school that taught people how the government functioned, and designed his own course by attending as many political events in Washington as he could House committee hearings, White House official speeches, and stump talks by any notable political figure. Kleberg authorized him to work as a House page for a few months, a position that allowed him to learn about the rules and practices of the House and become acquainted with its members. Johnson was also distasteful of the Hoover administration's lack of response to the Great Depression, even remarking that President Hoover stood for do-nothing government. Dalek writes that Lyndon was excited by Huey Long, a Democrat who entered the Senate in 1932 and captured attention with his solutions to the Depression that enraged other politicians. Johnson made a deal with the Senate doorkeeper to tip him off whenever Long was speaking, and would later say of Long, "I thought he had a heart for the people. He hated poverty with all his soul and spoke against it until his voice was hoarse." Johnson also supported Long's Share Our Wealth Society and a tax proposal to limit family fortunes to $5 million. In the 1932 presidential election, Johnson had been disappointed that Gardner settled for second place as Franklin D. Roosevelt's running mate, but was a supporter of the New Deal nonetheless and delighted in Roosevelt's election and Democratic control of both chambers. Despite his support for the New Deal, Johnson was not a liberal ideologue while working for Kleberg and identified with the wealthy men around the congressman. Roy Miller, a Washington lobbyist who made $80,000 a year and used Kleberg's office like it was his own, treated Johnson like his own personal secretary. Dalek writes that Lyndon was most interested in being effective in learning how to win elections, use government for practical ends, and carve out a niche for himself in the world of politics. In June 1932, Johnson returned to Texas to aid Kleberg's primary campaign against three other Democrats, with the victory in the primary of the Blue District being tantamount to winning the general election. Johnson saw Kleberg visiting all 11 counties as essential, laying the groundwork through his own crisscrossing of the district to make advance contacts. Kleberg won the primary with over 8,500 of the 50,000 votes cast and carried 10 of the 11 counties. Dalek writes that the election showed Johnson the value of careful grassroots work and how little ideology mattered in a campaign such as this. Around this time, Johnson also worked for Maury Maverick, a leading figure in the Citizens League, who had launched a campaign for tax collector in San Antonio. In September 1934, Johnson traveled to Austin and met Claudia Alta Taylor, also known as Lady Bird. The pair had a 10-week whirlwind marriage. Lady Bird arrived in Austin earlier that year for the purpose of remodeling her father's house. Lady Bird would later say that after her first meeting with Lyndon, she knew she had met something remarkable, but I didn't know quite what. In the days after their first meeting, Lyndon took Lady Bird to meet his parents and the Klebergs, and she in turn took him to meet her father. Lyndon twice asked her to marry him, but she did not reply. They then carried on a long-distance romance through phone and mail. He once showed up at her home a full day before he was scheduled to, and suggested they get married in 2 weeks from now, a month from now, or right away, with Lady Bird only agreeing to an engagement ring. Despite a warning from her aunt in Alabama to not marry a strange male she had only known for 2 days, Lyndon and Lady Bird married on November 17, 1934, at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in San Antonio. Lyndon also cultivated a father-son relationship with Sam Rayburn. Their pair became so close that when Lyndon was hospitalized with pneumonia, Rayburn sat by his bedside and told him, "Now, Lyndon, don't you worry, take it easy. If you need money or anything, you just call me." It was Rayburn who came to Senator Tom Connally with the request that he speak to President Roosevelt about appointing Lyndon to head the Texas NYS. LBJ went to Maury Maverick, the latter promising to speak to President Roosevelt and Aubrey Williams. FDR was reluctant to appoint someone so young to head the organization, but agreed with Maverick's assessment that LBJ would be better suited to understand the problems of the people he would be helping than an older person, and relented due to Johnson's support from Williams and the Congress members from Texas. Johnson saw the advantages of becoming head of the Texas NYA, believing it would allow him to make local and statewide contacts for future campaigns. Dalek stresses that Johnson's first concern was helping needy youngsters, noting that nothing in politics appealed more to him than marrying his ambition to help for the poor. 1935 saw around 125,000 16 to 25-year-old Texans on relief, which totaled to 5% of youngsters in the then 48 states requiring assistance. Williams requested that Johnson not hire anyone or make commitments until Washington was more concrete on its plans, but the latter felt that a program meant to help thousands of students resume classes would need to get started as soon as possible. Johnson also publicized the program through enlisting state and local officials for aid, getting a staff, and creating plans to help young people remain in school. Johnson had a meeting with Governor of Texas Jimmy Allred, who promised him full cooperation. Johnson requested L.E. Jones to take the position of assistant director and outlined a 4-point program to aid college students. The NYA headquarters in Washington found Johnson to be too fast-paced, even ordering him not to officially appoint Jones as assistant secretary until after a meeting of all state directors. Johnson responded, "We have a big state, consequently a big job, and since our time is short, if we are going to put the program over, we must start moving." Williams was reluctant to move quickly despite pressure from multiple state directors. Dalek writes that although Williams was a radical who hated poverty and all those privileged Americans who acquiesced in it, he was nonetheless unwilling to let the NYA make any false steps that could be used against it later. Johnson alternatively thought it was a mistake to wait, causing his appointments of principal deputies and opening of an office before the Washington meeting. Johnson attended the Washington meeting where he had his first direct meeting with President Roosevelt. Williams rejected the proposals of the various state directors on the grounds that they violated federal regulations. FDR noted this was the first time the federal government had tried a great national project of this kind and met separately with Johnson afterward. Johnson began a routine of testing both his endurance and co-workers with 16 to 18-hour workdays, 7 days a week. Johnson's days also consist of eating lunch at his desk and dinner at home with his associates. Afterward, the group traveling back to the Littlesfield office for more hours of work, where they would have to take their work with an old gas light and walk down 6 flights in the dark due to the superintendent turning the lights off at 10:30. Dalek writes that Lyndon would on occasion become wildly abusive of well-meaning subordinates who were working to the limits of their capacity, flying into rages in which he unleashed a stream of curses the likes of which some in the office had never heard before. Johnson reprimanded them for having sloppy desks and clean ones, and prodded his employees with threats of dismissal and reminders of what they could have happened to them if they lost their jobs. A staff member remarked, "God, he could rip a man up and down." Johnson shared the view of administration officials that public support for the NYA was essential to its success. Each director sent up an advisory board that would aid the NYA in gaining acceptance in each state, and Johnson chose a 5-man group that represented different regions and interests of Texas. This put him at odds with Washington NYA Assistant Director John J. Corson, who demanded he select men under the age of 25 instead of older males. Johnson asserted that the ones he picked contributed more than their younger counterparts. Seeking to get the best possible publicity for the program, Johnson cultivated businessmen, civic leaders, government officials, newspapermen, and school boards, in addition to speaking before Rotary, Lions, Kiwanis, and Optimist clubs. Criticism for the NYA was blunted, with Johnson emphasizing that it was not political and based entirely on American traditions. The efforts on the part of Johnson and his staff aided thousands of youngsters in getting jobs and remaining in school. 4,500 letters were mailed to school authorities and families by the Educational Division of Johnson's NYA office to better explain the school aid program. Letters that advised children could earn up to $6 a month in the event that they provided their parents were on relief, employed with the PWA, or part of the Rural Rehabilitation Program. By September 1936, which commenced the new school year, the NYA aided 12,342 boys and girls to continue their schooling. Dalek writes that the college aid program had been even more successful as the fewer schools available allowed the program to reach a larger percentage of needy students in a shorter time span. Williams publicly described the Texas operation as a first-class job and privately said it was an example for other states' youth administrations. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to Johnson in January 1936, lauding his efforts for aiding youngsters to find employment. The First Lady traveled to Texas later that year to uncover why the Texas NYA director was performing so effectively. When Johnson left the post, he was succeeded by Jesse Kalam. The latter was called to Washington by Williams, who told him, "This man Johnson was operating the best NYA program in all of the states. You can't do a better job than he was doing. I hope you can do as well." In February 1937, Congressman James B. Buchanan, who represented Texas' 10th Congressional District, died. Lyndon became interested in running for his seat, as the former's career had shown that winning a U.S. House election in Texas meant a strong likelihood that the winner would stay in office for another 20 years. Lady Bird and Wirtz were the first people Johnson consulted over a possible campaign. Wirtz initially laid out the negatives of the campaign, including Lyndon having to give up his position in the NYA and the low chances of him defeating older, more seasoned politicians, but was nonetheless attracted to his candidacy as he shared his support for the New Deal. Aubrey Williams learned of Lyndon wanting to run and requested White House aide Thomas G. Corcoran get FDR to stop him, reasoning that Lyndon was his whole youth program in Texas, and that he would be out of one with him gone. FDR had won the district in 1936 by a margin of 9-1. The Johnson campaign knew that identifying with FDR was a strategy that would be used by his opponents, but it sought to outdo the others in their association with him and paint Johnson as the one candidate truly backing the popular president. After the Johnson campaign released posters indicating the former's strong support for Roosevelt, journalists joked that the campaign should feature the slogan, Franklin D., Lyndon B., and Jesus C. Other candidates attempted to associate themselves with Roosevelt, and Johnson countered by questioning their sincerity and commitment, even declaring, "There is only one issue in this campaign. Are you for the president or against him?" Johnson's young age was an issue in the campaign. Johnson would call himself almost 30 and follow advice from his father to emphasize the age issue instead of obscuring it. Johnson was able to persuade Albert S. Burleson, the former postmaster general under President Woodrow Wilson, to write a letter that stated for the district to elect a young man that could develop, and that electing an older person would be tantamount to throwing the office away. Burleson had first been elected to Congress at age 34. Johnson debated Emmett Shelton in Bastrop County, their exchange exploding into an oral fire, as Shelton charged Johnson of runaway expenditures, being supported by the sulfur interest and utilities, never repaying a student loan, and being too new to the district to serve it well in Congress. Dalek writes that Johnson's aggressive identification with Roosevelt, the stumbling campaigns of his opponents, his unrelenting efforts to become known in every corner of the district through personal appearances, newspaper ads, mailings, and radio talks, gave him a surprisingly large victory margin on Election Day. Johnson differed from his opponents in performing well across the whole district, finishing in first place in 6 counties, second in 2, and third in 2. A picture was taken of Johnson laying in a hospital bed the day after the election, Dalek writing that the warm smile he had in the image reflected the satisfaction of a man who had fulfilled a long-standing hope.